The following presentation is brought to you by the Realm Network.
Today on Mr. Media, I'll talk to Jim Melvin, author of the 6-book, long-running horror series, The Death Wizard Chronicles, and a personal friend for as long as I can remember. Stick around and try to look past his gentle demeanor. There is some scary shit going on in this man's brain. So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is a Mr. Media interview, brought to you by Amazon.com, Audible.com, and 1-800-DIAL-DJs. Please stop by the website, MrMedia.com, click on our advertisers, support the show. And remember, there's more than 1,000 interviews available at MrMedia.com. We've been doing this since February 2007. Hope you'll find something you like. And thanks for listening. Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience that won't be happy with this interview until virgin blood is spilled and covers the Pergo floors in the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. If you or a friend has always dreamed of writing the great American novel, well, this is probably not the interview for you. But if you or a friend has always wanted to write a horror series requiring the creation of an entire world, multiple cultures, at least one language, violent death, aggressive sex practices, and a sense of fear for and about every new character introduced, I think you'll feel right at home with my friend, Jim Melvin. Jim is the author of the 6-book series, The Death Wizard Chronicles. 5 of the 6 books have been published to date, and book 6, Healed by Hope, is just a few months away. The Death Wizard Chronicles has been a story alive in the Melvin brain for many years before it ever hit bookshelves for the first time in 2007. I can still remember Jim describing what he hoped to write one day and being awed by how detailed his imagination truly was. Now, when the first book, a massive tome, even for the horror and fantasy genre, was published, his friends and family were impressed by the sheer accomplishment of it and what it said of Jim's determination. I suspect most of us thought, sorry to tell you this, Jim, that might be as far as he got. Jim never let go of his dream, however, even as one publisher evaporated and he moved to another. Would anyone really publish thousands upon thousands of pages of the Death Wizard Chronicles to see Jim's vision fully realized? Hell yeah! Now, I first had Jim on this show when Book 1, Forged in Death, was published, and while many years have passed and at least one of us has picked up some gray, I'm thrilled to have him back to discuss the approaching completion of the series. Jim Melvin, my old friend, and now a grandfather since his last appearance, grandfather twice over. Welcome back to Mr. Media.
It's great to be here, Bob, and one of the things you said was very accurate. The part about the awe-inspiring is, I've always been described as that.
Oh, I thought maybe the virgin blood spilling on the floor. I figured, Okay. So, I mean, was I exaggerating when I said that this was a long-term dream of yours?
Yeah, you are not exaggerating. In fact, you were probably understating, because this was a dream that was literally in the works for, 40-plus years. It started when I was a young boy growing up on Coquina Key, not far from where you live in St. Petersburg, Florida. And I hung out with a group of boys my age, and we did things that boys back then did. It's a cliche, but there were no video games. There was no computers. You picked up a stick, and that was a ray gun. You picked up a metal lid from a trash can, and that was a shield. And you ran around for hours on end just playing imaginary games. And when I was a teenager, Stephen King started writing his first books, Carrie and Salem's Lot, and I loved them. And a friend came up to me and introduced me to a series called Lord of the Rings, which I had never heard of. Lord of the Rings was published in the mid-'50s, but it really didn't become popular until the hippie era, late '60s into the '70s. And I picked up Lord of the Rings really having no idea what to expect, and it just blew me away. And it changed me as a reader and eventually as a writer, basically for the rest of my life. We all have genres that we prefer. You know, certainly epic fantasy is my favorite. I also like horror, and I like science fiction, and I like thrillers, and I even like real literature. You know, John Updike, I'm a big fan of his. But it changed my direction, and in high school, I decided very boldly that I was going to become a best-selling novelist, and I was going to write this series and make millions of dollars. And in fact, I even told people $75 million. I had a direct figure, you know, so I'm not quite there yet. But my imagination began as that boy and was sparked as a teenager by J.R.R. Tolkien, and here we are.
Well, and I can actually remember sitting around the pool at your old house and you telling my wife and I, well, your vision for this series. And, you know, I remember I seem to recall that we left that day going, man, he's really got it figured out. I hope he gets the chance to do it. And, of course, now, I mean, and you were just saying that, you know, you were really inspired by Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings. Something that didn't really exist, I don't think, when we would have had that conversation many, many years ago was George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones series. I'm going to go out on a ledge here and say that what you've actually written is probably closer on the scale to Thrones than maybe Rings. Is that an exaggeration?
Well, it's accurate. It's half accurate and half not accurate. It's accurate in the regard that J.R.R. Tolkien, that Tolkien could probably be read by, you know, 12 and up, and my series is more, you know, 18 and up, like Game of Thrones, in that it has, you know, graphic content and sexual content. It'd be R-rated if made into movies. Hopefully, it will be. But my series has a lot more, is more like Lord of the Rings in the regard that it has a lot of magic, and Martin's series, you know, it's brilliantly written. He's the best there is. I mean, few people argue that, but his magic is very subtle and very, you know, a small part of the story. In my series, and a lot of epic fantasy series, the magic plays a big role. Everybody has magic, and it's not so much that magic's rare, it's more who is the more powerful magician is where the conflict is.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with what you said. I mean, the graphic nature of what you've done and the sexual nature of it, I think, is what makes it, in my mind, closer to Thrones than to Lord of the Rings. So, so along that,
I like to make that point because you, as a writer, obviously you want to sell as many books as you can, but you don't ever want to purposely offend someone. So it's good to get it out front that it's an adult series.
Yeah, I think that's important. Well, you know, I keep saying I don't want my daughter to read it, but then I keep forgetting. Oh yeah, she's almost 18. I can't quite, you know. You know, it's always been said that writers should write what they know, but I'm kind of assuming that is not advice that you followed with the Death Wizard Chronicles. That the majority of these tales are made up of whole cloth, and that you have not actually, you know, slain any beasts or. Well, maybe you've lain with a lot of women. I don't know. A lot of creatures. I have to admit, folks, I do not know exact details of that part of his life. Maybe what I do know, I'll keep to myself. But I mean, you know, that's not all stuff that you've experienced firsthand, obviously.
Well, let me give you a very long answer to that. All
right, let me just get comfortable then.
That's right.
Okay, go ahead.
When I was in high school, I decided, as I said, that I was going to become a writer. But I knew I would need to support myself for a couple of years until all the millions started rolling in. So I became a journalist. And I did write a book. It wasn't this series, but I wrote a book, and it was a horror story, and I shopped it around. This was when I was about 20 years old, and it didn't sell, but I didn't care because the series was really what I thought was going to be my bread and butter. And meantime, I got married, and I started working at a large newspaper, and I started buying houses, mowing yards, and having kids. And the second book didn't happen. And, you know, I was 20 years old when I wrote the first one. I was 45 years old and still had not written the second one. And how many people do that? You have these dreams as a growing up, and you just never realize them. Life gets in the way. Well, at age 45, my second wife and I, and current wife and I, had an opportunity to move up to South Carolina in the foothills of the mountains, a beautiful place to write, a beautiful place to live. And we made the decision to take 3 years off and just live on savings so that I could achieve this dream and actually write the series, because apparently I wasn't capable of doing it while I was working full time. And so we did that. And starting in about 2004, we moved up here, and I sat down one night and wrote the first word. And about 3 years later, I'd written the 700,000th word of book 6 and finished the series. And the reason I'm responding in this way is because I always blamed it on work, but in reality, what I finally came to realize was I just wasn't ready. I wasn't ready as a writer. My worldview wasn't large enough. I didn't have the material in place to write the kind of series that I wanted to write. So when we first moved up here, of course, I'd grown as an adult, and I've studied some Eastern philosophy, and we all sort of have a big mishmash of things that creates our own worldview, whether it's spiritual or political or however you define it. And before I even wrote the first word, I spent about 2 months and I read a total of exactly 75 nonfiction books, everything from, what they wore in the medieval age all the way to the horses for dummies, anything I could read about that would increase my knowledge. And so when I sat down to actually write, first off, I'd been envisioning the plot and the characters of the series for 25 years. So, when I was in the shower, when I was driving, anytime I'm falling asleep at night, I would be thinking about it and plotting it. And then I did all of this research, and I did some interviews, and I even did a walk with a nature enthusiast through the mountains and asked him a bunch of questions. So when I sat down to write the first word, I was like this athlete in perfect shape, just ready to run the race. And I did, and I ran the race. And when I wrote the series, it was almost as if I was channeling. I never had writer's block. I just sat down and I just started typing, and the words just flowed out of me the entire time. And so, in retrospect, it was an all's well that ends well situation, because even though it took me 25 years to do it, I did it right. And if I had written it as a younger person, it would not have been the series that it is now.
I can see that. I know in my own experience, I felt over the years, I always wanted to write a novel, but I never felt like I had that kind of worldview yet. I felt like the people that I read and enjoyed reading, they had an understanding of something in the world that I just wasn't ready for. I just wasn't there yet. So yeah, I get that.
Right.
Also, I mean, it is remarkable that you found someone who allowed you to take 3 years off and spend down your savings to get this done. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, and I do owe her. And I also owe my second wife for introducing me to Eastern philosophy. Again, this isn't a book about Eastern philosophy, but part of it, Eastern philosophy has kind of an erotic feel and a philosophical feel that worked well with the story I was trying to tell. And without, being introduced to it by her, I wouldn't have had that element. And that became a very strong element in the series, I think, that gives it a lot of depth.
Well, I was going to say, you talk on your blog about karma and meditation, and that has a place in the book. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I'd like to qualify it by saying this book is action-packed and is very fast-paced, and it has a very active plot. So if you're the kind of reader who just likes to read for fun and entertainment, you get enough on your mind, and that's all you're worried about, this series certainly does that for you. But if you're the type of reader who likes to dig a little deeper and maybe learn some things and just, like I say, dig deeper into what the series is about, then it also has those elements. And the Eastern philosophy, and Buddhism especially, there's several different cores to Buddhism. One is the concept of karma, which basically means that anything you do comes back to you in kind. So if you do something good will come back. Bad, bad, neutral, neutral. And it's over the long term. It's not like you help an old lady cross the street and 5 minutes later something great happens to you, but it all builds up in a sort of almost like avalanche of behavior. And the other thing that Buddhists believe and Eastern philosophy believes is it's the concept of mindfulness, and that is living in the present moment is really all that life is about. And the fear of death is really not what you should fear, but rather a life lived in ignorance. And a life lived in ignorance is defined in a lot of specific ways that are delved into in the series.
So you didn't imagine those aspects of the book in all those years leading up to 2007, I'm guessing. And when you were in your 20s or early 30s, mindfulness and karma, those were not really things you were seeing. You were seeing the action, you were seeing the otherworldliness of it, but maybe not, maybe the interaction of these unique characters, but that other stuff was not there yet for you.
Right. It became the final ingredient, I think, that made the soup taste really good.
Ooh, a food analogy. Well done. Well done, Grandpa. Um, did the story end up where you always thought it would, or did your characters, as they actually came to life on the page on the computer screen, did they alter your plans a bit?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think probably most writers are asked that question, and the answer is yes, they do. The characters become real to you, and they take on their own personalities, and they even quarrel with you, and they tell you, no, we're not going to do it this way, we're going to do it that way. So the overall plot and the structure and the way it began, the way it ended remained the same, but everything in between was a lot different. And that was good too. And it's almost impossible, I think, as a writer to not have that happen. But it is amazing how the characters really do come to life. And when someone dies, you feel sad, and when something good happens to someone, you feel happy, and you start rooting for your own characters. And when you write too, I mean, any writer can relate to this. When you hit an action scene where things are happening really fast, you write faster. And when you hit a scene where things are slow and developing, you write slower. And it's part of the, both the pleasure and the agony of being a writer, because it's not all fun and games. And sometimes it's torturous, but once it gets into your blood, you're driven to do it.
Did you, as you're writing and you're thinking about these characters, did they ever take you somewhere that you did not want to go?
Yeah, I would say so. This is going to maybe get a little bit too deep, but part of my worldview is, you hear this again, human beings are the only sentient creatures who are aware that they're going to die. We're the only ones who know that, and I think subconsciously that creates a sort of madness that we can keep down on the surface, and we can live ordinary lives, but it's always there. And going into the philosophical elements of that, and creating characters who are both, surface characters, but also symbols of the various aspects of that. Yeah, I went pretty deep psychologically, and it could be painful, and writing this series changed me in some ways, but not all negative and not all positive. It added some depth, and I saw some things that, I think all writers are this way to some regard. You see some things. Any artist is going to see things maybe that a non-artist doesn't, because that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with the deepest elements and the psychological elements of being a human being.
Now, in the same way you said that the action sequences tend to get written faster because they're happening faster and you get all worked up in them. There's also sex sequences in here, and it's funny. I thought of this. I have a buddy from high school. Steve Golden, shout out to Steve Golden, there you go, who we were having this conversation once about books, and he said, I wonder if writers, if novelists who write these, steamy scenes, if they get turned on by their own, stuff. So on behalf of Steve Golden, 30 years ago, I will ask you this question. When you write these sex scenes in these books, do you get turned on by that? Do you, say, honey?
I have to give you the boring answer. The answer is no, you do not, because
sorry, Steve.
It's the craft of writing. You write one sentence at a time, and so you concentrate on that one sentence, and you concentrate on the next sentence, you concentrate on the next sentence, and a sex scene could take 3 days, and I'm in good shape, but 3 days is a little long even for me, so no, it doesn't, and you're not afraid you're not frightened by the monsters, and you're not you don't fall in love with the beautiful woman, but again, you're affected in other ways. I think you're affected more psychologically because you're delving into things that a lot of people don't do.
All right. So we've covered writing about action and writing the sex stuff. What about creating an entire language? Something that you also did here. I mean, you basically created your own version of Klingon to help the Trekkies understand where we're going with this. How does that come about? And what kind of what kind of research, if any, did you have to do? What kind of training did you have to do to create a language that had some cohesion?
Right. Well, Tolkien had a big advantage because he was a linguist, and I'm not a linguist. So I knew that if I just made up a language, I'd sound stupid. You just can't just start making up a bunch of words. What a lot of epic fantasy writers do is they'll base their ancient languages on, say, German or Latin or a variety of languages that actually exist, and that's what I did too. But the language I chose was Pali, which is actually now a dead language. It's only spoken in rituals by Buddhist monks, and it's closely related to Sanskrit, which most people have heard about. But when you translate Pali, when you translate English words into Pali, it has a very, again, erotic sound. And so I actually hired a professional translator, and the sentences that I wrote in English that I wanted to be in the ancient language, I had her translate. So the very few people in the world who can speak Pali and read Pali, they'll see that my language is for real. There's some variations, and it's not completely accurate, and that was for editing purposes. But I always use a parenthetical English phrase after the ancient language so that, if you're just sick of looking at that, you can just read the parentheses and then follow along that way.
Well, okay, so speaking of proficiency, can you say anything in this language of yours?
Oh, boy. Probably not, to be honest with you.
Maybe I should have given you a heads up on that question, give you a little opportunity to practice. I mean, I imagine the first Star Trek writer who heard someone actually making conversation in Klingon offset was probably like, "What the?"
Yeah, that's right.
You guys.
If I had a book with me, one of my books with me beside me, I could read it. But no, I definitely can't speak, and there's only very few thousand people in the world who can.
That's crazy. All right, so. Tell me about fans of the series. I mean, it's been out there now for 7 years. I'm sure there are people who are hanging on every word. What surprised you about people who have kind of really fallen in love with the Death Wizard Chronicles series?
Well, I've had several surprises. One good one is, of course, some people have really loved it from start to finish. I've had some people say that, and you hear this a lot in series, is that maybe book one is a little slow, but once they get to book two, then they loved it. I've had some people talking about the sexual elements, not very many, but one or two that were very offended by the sex, and that surprised me because I always thought if you're an adult, sex is one of the things you might enjoy reading about. But the series, as you mentioned, first came out with a Canadian publisher called Rain back in about 2007, and I was unlucky in the regard that when I was finished the series was just about the exact same time that the economy crashed, and one of the industries hit hardest was the publishing industry. So it became very difficult for a new writer to break in. And also the internet was also really heating up then, and the internet, as we know, has really changed the way people read. So that not only was the economy going bad, but there were fewer readers and fewer people buying books. The first publisher did a good job, and the first 4 books came out, and then all of its writers got the dreaded email, "I'm sorry, we're going out of business, we just can't do it." And a lot of small publishers at that point, of course, that happened to, and a lot of small businesses, period. So I was back out on the open market, and I was very lucky. Talking about a shout out, a friend of mine named Chris Stevenson, who's a very good science fiction writer, he connected me with this publisher called Bellbridge Books, and they were looking for an epic fantasy series, and the timing was right, and I hooked on with them. And Bellbridge Books is run by several writers who were former and I guess current New York Times best-selling writers, so they really knew what they were doing, and they did it right. The editing was fantastic, the covers are fantastic, the production's fantastic. But again, unless you sign with one of the several major publishers, it's, the smaller publishers and the mid-sized publishers don't have the distribution. So then, becoming a New York Times bestseller is more difficult, and so the author is more responsible for marketing, and you work in conjunction with your publisher to do the very best you can. But overall, I was very lucky to get with Bellbridge Books, and the response has been really positive. About the only negative, almost any author would say this: if you're not named J.K. Rowling or Stephen King, you wish you had sold more. But hopefully, the best is still ahead.
Now, we talked about you working in the newspaper business, but you've worked as an editor. I'm not aware that you've actually worked as a writer in newspapers. Am I?
I did some writing at the St. Pete Times. I was in the features department, and I wrote a bunch of things about health and fitness and science and nature.
I apologize.
Well, that's all right,
that, yeah.
But you're right. Overall, it is ironic in the sense that I wasn't a reporter my entire life, and I then became a novelist. I was a journalist my entire life, but for me, the promotions and the higher salaries and everything were either in design or supervision, and that's the direction I went. And it didn't bother me because I still considered myself, I've always considered myself a novelist who supports myself as a journalist, not vice versa.
Well, I was going to ask if the journalism training, as it were, was helpful or not, or less than helpful in terms of writing fiction. And before you answer that, I would guess that being around journalism as long as you have been, you have a sense of the value of being able to write quickly and succinctly and then put it down and move on to the next thing, which a lot of people who want to be novelists and write fiction, they don't really have that, and so they tend to linger for ages over each word or a page, and it's not an efficient way to get it done.
Right. Well, I would say journalism did two things for me. One is, we talked earlier about, rounding out my worldview. As a journalist, you're involved with everything, and you learn a lot of things. And also, just you work so much as an editor and a writer and a designer with words that my punctuation and grammar and vocabulary were all there. Writing is the voice you develop as a writer is a combination of so many different things: your education, your environment, everything. And journalism will help to round out that voice, and it did for me, and it gave me a good command of the language that I don't think I would have had I been an accountant or a real estate agent or
I just remembered a question I had for you that I was going to ask before. When we were talking about the original writing of the book, when you sat down and you started writing book 1, and then you basically spent 3 years and you got to the end of book 6, did you have to rewrite a lot? When you start writing it, it's of a certain tone and pace, and then you get to the end, and it may have evolved quite a bit, not just the narrative, but the style. And I wondered if you had to go back to the beginning and make the style and the pace match up with the end, or if you just decided, it'll just be self-correcting as people go along.
Well, those are excellent questions, especially when you're talking about someone who's written a 6-book series versus just one book. And that did happen, and it affected the series with the second publisher much more than it did with the first, because the advantage with the second publisher was we were starting from scratch. Only all 6 books were written. So if there was a development that happened in book 6 that maybe didn't quite jive with book 1, I was able to fix that, number one. There were very minor examples of that. But the real thing that happened was the editor that I ended up with Bellbridge, her name is Pat Van Wee. She was extraordinary, but she was not easy on me. And in fact, when I first submitted the book 1, she said, I like a lot of the elements in this, but you're really going to have to do a real serious rewrite. And so I did the cliche thing, and this is true. I rented a cabin in the mountains, and for an entire week I shut myself in the mountains and didn't walk out the door for a week until I rewrote that book. And the rewrite they accepted, and we took it from there. Every book since I've never sent a book in where Pat has said, "Oh, this is perfect," great. She's always had me reworking, and I've spent many hundreds of hours doing reworking. Obviously, much to the betterment of the series. And when you're working with a professional novel editor, it's a whole different experience than other kinds of editors. And it's really it's a wonderful experience, and you grow as a writer. And I'm working on a new novel now that's going to be a prequel to the series, and my style has evolved, I think, certainly from 2004 when I wrote the first few sentences of book one to now. And I think for the most part in a good way. It's always hard to tell when you're in a first draft. You always go through phases of oh, this is horrible or this is great. But it did evolve, but it evolved in a way that at the second time around with the new publisher, I was able to make book one was much more like book six in style because we reworked them.
We lose track as writers that every time an editor says you need to rework this, that editor is creating new work for them because they have to, especially if we're talking about a 700,000 word book series. That's that's a crazy amount of words. But
thanks to my editor, it's now only 650,000.
Oh, there you go. Okay, but so, I mean, she had to go and edit and reread that every time she had you rework something. She had to rework it, and I mean, a typical book these days is about 85,000 words. 100 is kind of a max, But
right.
These books of Mr. Melvin's here, these are massive tomes. I mean, so that's a lot of work for him and a lot of work for the editor as well. So,
and actually, since it's broken into 6 books, the books really only average between about 95 and 125. So this isn't like 6 books like George R.R. Martin that are 1,000 pages apiece. So each book itself is a relatively easy read.
They're big books, folks. They're big books. All right, so I guess I've got 2 last things to ask you about.
Okay.
One is I want to take from what you were just saying a second ago that you have started on another series. This is a prequel. Do you have a name for this new series?
Yeah, one of the main characters in the Death Wizard Chronicles, who has proved to be very popular, is a dragon named Bayatupa. And Bayatupa symbolically is like literally a dragon-sized fear of death. He's obsessed with dying, and he's trying throughout the entire series to find out a way to not die, even though he's already 80,000 years old. You think you'd be happy with that? But a lot of people like Bayatupa, and he evolved during the Death Wizard Chronicles. And there's references in the Death Wizard Chronicles to a period 30,000 years before called the Dragon Wars, where there were thousands of dragons, and they basically got into wars that decimated themselves and the planet. And so this new, I'm not sure if it's going to be a standalone or it's going to be a series. I started out thinking it would be a standalone, but it's starting to look like it's going to become a series. And it's all about Bayatupa and these dragon wars 30,000 years before the first page of the Death Wizard Chronicles. And I'm blanking out on what I was about to say there.
Where are you going?
Here's my point. Here's my point is that I'm writing it in a way that you don't have to have read the Death Wizard Chronicles to read this series. So if you were to pick this up first, you could still read it. Now, if you have read the Death Wizard Chronicles, all the better. But I want to purposely have Bayatupa the Great, it's going to be called, be able to be read on its own.
All right. And the last thing I have to ask you, I probably didn't ask you the last time we had this conversation on the show, did any of our mutual friends or family members find their way into the book slightly disguised? Are there any characteristics of anyone I would recognize within the book? Nope.
Well,
no
certainly
one's watching.
me.
No one can hear you, Jim. So just go ahead and tell me.
Certainly me, because the main character is 7 feet tall, 300 pounds, and heavily muscled and handsome. So that's me, of course. And then otherwise, I don't think pretty much anyone else I know, family or friend-wise, can measure up.
All right. Well, I would like to see a dragon named Mr. Media in the new series. That way I'll know that you're paying attention to me half as much as I'm paying attention to you. All right. Well, folks, listen. You can find the Death Wizard Chronicles by my friend Jim Melvin right here in front of us in great bookstores everywhere, or you can order right now online at a great price at MrMedia.com. And if you watch the show, you know how this works. If you're watching this on MrMedia.com, right below this video screen, or you'll see copies of the book covers. You can click on them. Amazon can get them to you in about 30 minutes or less via drone, or if that's not available in your area, you can get it in a day or two. I believe, Jim, are they all available now as ebooks as well?
Yeah, definitely, and all ebook venues.
Okay, so there's that. And did I see when I was doing a little bit of research that at least one of the books has been an audiobook as well?
Yeah, in fact, book one is an audio book, and there are also two free short stories, and one of those is an audio book.
And are those available on your website, or are those available on the Kindle?
They're also available on Amazon.
Okay.
They're not in print form, the two short stories, but
all right.
They're sort of teasers to just get you, a free way to get into the series to see if you find it interesting.
A taste of heroin to get you hooked.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know how you guys work. All right, and what is your website, Jim?
It is www.jim-melvin.com. And everything you need to know is there.
All right. Really, everything I need to know about anything, or just about your books? Go ahead and answer say everything you need to know about everything is right there on my website, Bob. That'll drum up traffic. And are you on social media? Can people find you? Facebook, Twitter, all that kind of stuff?
Facebook, Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter and Facebook. So yes.
All right. Well, folks, my friend Jim here is a little shy of the $75 million that he originally set out to attain. So if you and several of your friends would go out and buy print editions, or at least download the ebook editions of the first 5 books in the series of the Death Wizard Chronicles, he would appreciate it. I would appreciate it. And then, Jim, when is book 6 due out?
Book 6 will be out before the end of the year. I would say sometime between September and December.
And that is Healed by Hope.
Healed by Hope.
Okay.
And it definitely is the climactic book of the series.
Very nice. Well, Jim, always a pleasure to see you, whether in person or this way. I wish you great success in getting to the 6th book and then starting a new series or a new book, whatever it is you choose to do. And thank you so much for joining us on Mr. Media today.
Thank you, Bob. And again, this is a great service you do, and it's very much appreciated by authors like me.
My pleasure. All right. Not too offended, are you?
No. So far, very accurate.
All right.
The preceding presentation was brought to you by the Realm Network.